All right, everybody, we have an incredible guest today, and I am so freaking excited about this guy that I'm going to tell you right now before I even introduce him. Go to his Substack, askapol.com, subscribe, support this man. Here's what he does. He's a Wired, Vice, Playboy, Rolling Stone contributor. He's also a part-time Johns Hopkins professor, but what's really freaking amazing about him is this new endeavor he started called Askapol, or Ask a Politician. So Matt's based on Capitol Hill. That means Monday through Friday, he is up at Congress, chasing down legislators, sticking a microphone in their face and asking them questions. But the crazy thing about Matt and his project with Askapol is that he's asking the questions that everyday citizens want to know. He's created a community where I can tell Matt what's important to me, and then he will go ask Congress those questions that I care about. So rather than me throwing on the tube, hoping that CNN or Fox News or MSNBC or some corporate media outlet is going to ask the things that I care about, which they never do, I have a direct conduit to Congress through Matt. So if you want to ask Capitol Hill lawmakers questions that are important to you, go subscribe, check out Askapol, and have Matt ask questions on your behalf. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to the interview and introduce Matt Laslo, today's Paradigm Sherpa.
What I was hoping to talk to you about today was really just like how, you've got this career, for me on the outside looking in, where you write stuff for Wired, NPR, Rolling Stone, Playboy, Vice, and you're on Capitol Hill grinding every day asking, politicians stuff. And it seems like you've more recently just introduced this paradigm of a people powered press where, like, through Substack and Askapol, you are, obviously people have had Substacks before where they, have citizens fund their writing, but you're really unique in that you're on Capitol Hill all week and you're engaging with a community of people and having, people like me, everyday citizens, bring questions to you, and then you go take that to lawmakers and ask them. And nobody's doing that. Everybody still relies on the middleman of hoping that CNN or MSNBC or Fox News is going to ask some question that's representative of the people. And I mean, let's be real, at least in my opinion, they're never going to do that. It's not in their interest to genuinely represent the people. So I would just
Well,
love if you could talk
yeah.
about how this idea came to you and like
Oh,
why you brought.
1000%. Well, I
Yeah.
was going to say on that, these days, I'm a media professor on the side. When I watch CNN and all them, I'm kind of like, not shocked, but I'm like, you morons. Like, you've changed nothing. And like, you're still preaching to people. Like, the era of fact checks is over. And the more you fact check and fact check live, whether it's Trump or Biden, the more just large swaths of the public just writes you off because we are not the gatekeepers anymore. We think we are. Some of them at CNN get paid like they are, but
Right.
no, that whole model's been rejected.
Yeah. And, it's crazy how I've watched this grow so organically, right? Like, and I mean, from the outside looking in, I mean, you can tell
Yeah.
me since you're the one running it though, but like at first this seemed to kind of really get a lot of traction with, David Grush, the UAP stuff. And, now like I feel like in the past year you've gone from maybe tens of subscribers to thousands of subscribers from all over the world, right?
We're not even a year old yet. We turned a year old in June. So
Yeah,
this
so
experiment seems
a
to be
couple months.
working out. I think we're just shy of like 3,000 subscribers.
Okay.
Um, well, then I look at some of my colleagues and I'm like, wait, they've got tens of thousands of paid subscribers. And then I get reporter jealousy.
Well, I mean, don't be jealous, man. You're getting started and you're doing something that, like, again, is so unique. Like, uh, there's this guy who I think he's like a pretty famous marketer, Seth Godin. He wrote this book called Tribes, and the idea behind it was like, if you get a small nucleus of people that really dig what you're doing, that's better than having like a million people that only kind of like dig what you're doing. And I feel like that growth trajectory is like you're on the Bitcoin kind of rise, if you will, just with how you started this grassroots movement. Can you just tell me, from your perspective, what's been the most rewarding part of it so far for you, like building this community?
Well, that's where I love, kind of as you were saying before, but like the whole notion of a people powered press corps. It's a little bit of a tagline, but like there's so many questions. Like even last night, we broke news on Cory Booker on cannabis. Ask a Poll has the UAP vertical, then we have crypto, cannabis, migration, etc. We're going to slowly expand those out.
Yeah.
And if you can tell by those categories, they're kind of all the categories that the mainstream media just like passes over.
Mhm.
Even though our prisons are overflowing, even though there's shit flying above our military installations that people on the Intel committee don't know what they are. But the mainstream media is like, no, 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 we're just gonna stick with the party line or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, just last night we broke news with Cory Booker kind of saying that yeah, he's heard what I've got because one of our actually a source of mine told me that the DEA is going to move to deschedule marijuana on April 15th. And I like one of our subscribers asked me earlier in the day yesterday, hey, what's that going to mean for this marijuana banking bill? The SAFER, or used to be the Safe Banking Act. Now it's the Safer Banking Act. And so I saw Booker, asked him that guy's question, and then boom, broke news within minutes just because one of our followers sent us a great question. And so it's literally just taking myself out of the equation. And like I've got my own bureau where that I kind of turned into a wire service.
Mhm.
I call it a nationally focused regional wire service. With that wire service, my bureau is the Laslo Congressional Bureau, but just in the past year or two, I've changed it to the LCB. For one, that's what my interns call it, and they're cooler than me. But yeah, taking my own name, Laslo, out of my bureau is because, for one, I'm a little more gonzo than my bureau, having been a Playboy, Rolling Stone, Vice News Tonight correspondent. I write for the fun publications,
Yeah.
but personally been a little bit gonzo, but then my heart's always been with democracy and all that, which is why I'm a professor on the side at Hopkins and some other spots. And so, like, taking your own name, like, a lot of times I tell my students or whatever, as journalists, we're paid in bylines. I'm like, you
Mhm.
usually have to have at least starting off, you need to like have a separate gig to pay for your bad habit of journalism. So when I first got to DC 18 years ago, I helped refit a house on Capitol Hill on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then we'll be back on Monday in my suit, walking past the same like dirty bricks. Um, just because that's what you got to do to survive in this. Because like even though the economy's been changing and convulsing, like the journalism economy is its own separate thing. And
Sure.
because of our mistakes and the mistakes of our forefathers and mothers, like the mistake of our forefathers not allowing four mothers in the newsrooms for too long, like we just punished ourselves in so many ways. And like in the last couple elections, the terrifying thing to me as someone who loves this country and that like has a little faith in this experiment called democracy or republic or whatever we call it. But like seeing that about half of the American public, so it's not even that half the American public now, according to Pew, not even that half of them think that we're fake news and we get it wrong. About half of the public thinks we're actively lying to them.
Yeah.
And so, like even CNN, as crappy as they are, they lost 25% of their viewership at around the midterms last election because people are just fed up with us. And the more um, we parrot kind of the party line, which is the politician's line, which even though Washington's hyper partisan, there's still this baked in establishment where this groupthink between old guard Republicans, old guard Democrats, like they're 1,000% in agreement. Um, which is where we come to the UAP issue and where it's interesting because the bipartisanship in the what is it, zip lips of the Gang of Eight, which is the Speaker, then the Senate Majority Leader, and the Minority Leaders, and then the heads of the Intel committees. So that's 8 folks. They're called the Gang of Eight. Um, those folks, they're just like this separate entity, separate from Congress. Because I think even back when Bush had the warrantless wiretapping program, they were read in on the program. They're just not allowed to talk about it. Like they can go to jail if they divulge these secrets. And so part of me is like, damn, that's a really hard job because you saw some people, even on Senate Intel, like Ron Wyden from Oregon, he was doing everything he could to leak that program by the warrantless wiretapping without leaking that program. Because if he crosses this one line, boom, yeah, then he can go to jail. And so that's where, with the UAP issue, part of it, I think, is indifference, lack of curiosity among some of those party leaders on both sides. Um, but the more dismissive they are, the more curious we all get because we're like, you're got to be hiding something now. And it's just this self perpetuating cycle, which it kind of looks like the Congressional UAP caucus in the House is like, no, we had enough of this. We gotta, blow up the old system and create our own, which
it's really interesting.
They're making progress.
That group in particular, it seems to be a younger group of congressional leaders, right? That's really driving it, and it's almost to me, an uninitiated, lay member of the public. I'm like, wow, it's almost like younger people aren't subscribing to the old guard, so to speak, and following what seniority is saying. Like, now we're gonna mix things up and keep this issue around because we believe there's something to it.
And this is like where it's so fascinating because, like, for me, my politics is I hate both parties. I say blow it all up and start over again. Now, not physically blow it all up. You out there with reading material like I have. I just looked over at my anarchist cookbook in the corner because I'm studying extremists. When there's something terrifying on Amazon, if you order the anarchist cookbook, it sometimes arrives the next day, even when you don't rush order it. And I'm like, thanks, Bezos. Did not need this not making book that within 24 hours of ordering it, but good on you for rushing it, bro.
Yeah, that's bizarre.
Oh, I know. And so, like, we're in this new world, even though Washington is this old world. And we're in every recent election, we've been seeing this play out. And even I got to DC in 2006, right before Democrats took back control of the House under Speaker Pelosi. Her first speakership was 06. Remember, that was the anti-Bush, anti-war midterm. And back then, Democrats, they were out with signs saying Bush is Hitler, he's killing all these people. So, like, there's just this perpetual tit for tat where I just call it this race to the bottom here on Capitol Hill, or here in Washington more so, where both parties, like even talking to the oversight chair, James Comer, about the Biden impeachment, I was like, well, or he kept bringing up what they did to Trump, those 2 impeachments. And I was like, is this payback? And he didn't correct me. He kept saying, well, they should know this is coming. They should have known this was coming when they did that. And so, like, they're not even pretending anymore. And it's just anything the one party does, like what? A few years back in the State of the Union, the South Carolina Republican Joe Wilson yelled out, "You lie," to Obama. And that was the biggest scandal. And guess what? The next day, or even that night, I think he was forced to apologize. He told me later that he talked to Rahm Emanuel, White House chief of staff at the time, and apologized real quick, and he felt it, he felt remorse for it. Well, fast forward to Trump's first State of the Union, and you have Nancy Pelosi ripping up the president's speech. And it's just like, oh, like that day or that night, I was coming down the elevator with then MSNBC host, Cassie Hunt. I think she's now at CNN. But even this MSNBC host, she used to be AP and all these other publications, so she's been on the Hill since or for a decade, like I had been at the time. And I was just like, I'm always in the zone. And I think I was just going outside to have a quick smoke. Don't smoke, kids, but I was going outside to have a smoke. And she was done for the night. And I was like, finally turned to her and I go, can you believe the speaker ripped up or that Pelosi ripped up the president's speech? And this liberal MSNBC host, Cassie, goes, she's the speaker of the House. And like, she was aghast because it was like, wow, like this place has devolved so rapidly. And it's almost like if Pelosi hadn't done that, if Speaker Johnson hadn't rolled his eyes in the State of the Union address, Biden's last week or whenever it was, then they'd be punished by their partisan ranks. And that's where our founders envisioned statesmen, not quite stateswomen, but they left the space for us to get you all wise ladies eventually. But they wanted statesmen who would actually like come to Washington, think, and then come back to their people and be like, holy shit, guys, I learned this. Like, you paid me to study for a few months and I learned all of this. Like, I'm sorry, when I campaigned on this topic, I was wrong, you know? But these days, as my mentor at Hopkins, Doug Harris, who's now the head of Loyola's political science program, he says, these 2-year terms that the founders envisioned, biennial terms, they were meant to give space from lawmakers, space from their voters. And part of me is like, well, that's not good. I'm always torn, especially with transparency and state secrets or whatever. But it is the founders wanted, and actually, this is wild. Of the nation's 13 colonies, only one had 2-year terms, two had 6-month terms, and the rest had 1-year terms. So it was radical compromise to give the members of the House 2-year terms. And it was explicitly, a little aristocratic, which fuck that. But it was to give these lawmakers, for one, time to travel to Washington or to travel to the nation's capital, which was in New York and then Philly. But it was also because you might have this Southern lawmaker who's a farmer. Well, he's on the Maritime Committee, so he's got to learn about lobster law with Canada for the first time. And so with that, what my mentor Doug Harris says is these 2-year terms have just collapsed. Like these days, when a politician wins their election, I'm in the room with them, and who are they talking to? They're talking to all their donors, and they're basically saying, "Hey, thanks for maxing out last time. Need you to max out again." So they're running their next election the night they win, which I think is just the death of us all. And like one thing that's always pained me is saying how many tens of millions of Americans just don't vote. And that's where I'm like, wait. And I always ask my friends this, like, hey, does anything happening in Washington impact you? And especially like if they're in town and I give them a tour of the Capitol, at the end, I'll be like, hey, was like any of that meaningful to your life? And oftentimes the answer is no, which then I like use that as a critique of myself. But so many of the debates we're having in Washington are just, for one, made for donors. You have the donor class in both parties and the donor class doesn't mean the wealthy. Like, yeah, there's that donor class, but there's those folks who are going to chip in a buck anytime Trump texts them or MTG texts them or AOC texts them. And I get those texts and they're not nauseating, but it's effective and it works. And so I think both parties have become experts at selling doom. And like, I study a lot of, I call it Fox Newsmax, but I study the far right media and all that. And I understand, like, if you're a Republican, you can, like, you'd be an apostate to not want to impeach evil Joe Biden. Like, and that's where my fear these days is that we're not having disagreements right and left anymore. We're in 2 different universes. We're having 2 different conversations. And that's where with Askapol, what we're trying to do is bring the people back. And, you all, but with your wallets a little bit, but also having you all in our community feed us questions. Um, Oftentimes, after the Arrow report came out last week, what I'm looking for in there is totally different from other folks in this space. And so, yeah, I get my questions from there. Half my questions, or three-fourths of them, get scrapped because the community has better questions than me. And part of that's because I've been in DC 18 years. And like, even though I've tried to like, you know, stay above the fray, not drink the water, all that, especially by embracing DC's band scene. There's just like at a certain level, you can't help but be infected by Washington
Yeah.
think. And
Immersed in it.
so, yeah, and so that's why I love having this community to, keep me on my toes and keep this skeptic even more skeptical.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, you're a product of your environment to an extent, right? Or at least a lot of people like to say that. So it makes sense that if you're in the bubble, then you're eventually gonna, like, through osmosis, start to kind of think that way in a lot of ways. But I want to just circle back to something you said about when you were like
Yeah,
when
I
you
know. Sorry, I got a little Professor Laslo
Oh,
there.
no, that's good. Honestly, it was a good riff. I don't touch on a lot of important things. One of the things I thought was really important was you talk about you bring your friends around the Capitol and you ask them like, does this stuff even really impact you? And I think a lot of people would say no because a lot of people are so disenfranchised. They don't feel heard. They're grinding, like you and your, early days in Washington. They're just trying to put food on the table. They're stressed, and then the fear when they do watch the news, it's so much fear, and it's so divisive, and it's emotionally draining. Every time you turn on that fear propaganda, it works. Like it gets everybody super riled up, super heated. They start getting angry at everybody around them, and before you know it, it's just like it's not even worth watching because people realize like, oh, I'm just so worked up in it, and what can I do to really influence things? And that's where I think the genius of what you're doing, it's an outlet for people. It's like, hey, he's asking questions on our behalf that a lot come from the community and a lot come from his years of experience and wisdom, asking lawmakers questions. And it's not fear driven. You don't have an agenda besides taking questions and getting answers, like, or at least it seems to me and everybody who subscribes, like you're just taking maybe those couple of pillars: UAP, crypto, drugs. Yeah, I mean, that's important too. I mean, war on drugs is an absolute crime and a failed effort, and way overdue that we all start growing up about like
Dude, and
pot,
even
drugs
this
in
whole
general.
border, this whole border crisis we're having, why is it? Why is everyone fleeing Latin America? Because American guns are slaughtering their people to supply Americans' drug habits. Because guess what? Americans love drugs.
Yeah,
We just fucking love drugs. And we have millions of our peers locked up, or at least I'm in DC, but cannabis is now legal here. But we still have all these people locked up for it, which is just like, to me, the biggest sin. I mean, people in jail for what we can now do freely out here. Like, come on, at least examine that, folks. This is
no, and something that like, let's be real. Like, okay, smoking pot. I think the worst thing about it is it can make you like comfortable with being bored, or like and the only like booze has been legal forever, and people drink
smoke
booze.
weed every day, and I don't think anyone's accused me of that.
Yeah,
Though I do not push other people to smoke, talk to. I can give you advice if you were curious about that or any other drug because I've done a lot of them. But yeah. This is where, well, even in my backpack, I carry Narcan at
yeah,
the Capitol every day because people are like, or some people will be like, wait, why do you carry it there? Because every sector of American society loves drugs.
yeah,
Rush Limbaugh was an addict. We had, Pill Popper. Then Congressman Trey Radell, he got busted with cocaine. You know, every time I'm looking at those guys, there's this younger group of lawmakers who got elected with Trey Radell, the cocaine congressman, and they're still there. they didn't get busted. And I'm like, how much coke is in your nostrils? And we're just a nation that loves drugs.
No, I mean, even simplifying to coffee and tobacco, right? Like people want to overlook that, but like, no, we're using drugs to stay up. We're using drugs to numb ourselves. We're using drugs to explore our consciousness. Like, it's a individual. Well, I mean, it's a collective issue, but it's an individual
Yeah,
thing too. How, or it should be in my mind, like how you use or don't use drugs, like at least for adults, right? Okay, maybe
yeah,
it's different for developing children, but like,
yeah.
you know, if we
No, but
can't,
like also don't give your kids coffee. Like
yeah,
that, a lot of studies show that's bad. Just
yeah.
fucking
It's,
America.
yeah, I live in New Hampshire right now, and the Live Free
Oh,
or
nice.
Die, and
I
it's
used to be the
hilarious.
correspondent for NHPR for
That's
years.
it's so funny. When we were like every time I see you on a video, you have an anecdote about having covered somebody in
Oh, yeah.
like a state I used to, like Philly, Ohio. Like you've
Oh,
been all over the map, my friend.
I think like 46 or 48 states. I think there's only like two or three I haven't filed directly for. So my bureau or whatever covered Congress for local NPR stations. Um, Even though like that's always been my passion. Like, yeah, millions of people have heard me over the years, but they only heard me on NPR a couple times. Most of the time, I was their local correspondent in Philly or KPBS in San Diego, KUOW in Seattle, Vermont Public Radio, VPR, right next to you all in New Hampshire. But that's part of why, uh, as you can hear on Ask a Poll in our podcast, that's part of the relationships I have with all these lawmakers. Because whether they've been there a long time, and I think because I've been there 18 years, I think I've now been there longer than about 75% of Congress. Um, so yeah, I keep an eye on me. If I start growling like a swamp creature, put a couple bullets in me. Metaphorical ones, of course.
Yeah, of course.
But that
I'm glad you brought that up. Do you feel that helps you engage with longtime lawmakers, or do they run for the hills when they see you coming, or is it a combination of both?
combo of both, but like what, even State of the Union night, I said hi to Vice President Kamala Harris because she knows me. She didn't love me. She didn't like me half the time, but I was always asking her about drug policy for Capital Public Radio in Sacramento, but also KQED in San Fran and stuff. And so, yeah, I was her local correspondent. And so people on my Instagram, it's like blown up with a bunch of like hate. I think there's like 800 or 900 comments now on that video of Kamala Harris. And
Mhm.
like 70, 80% of them are nasty. Like someone linked to it, but it's just a bunch of trolls and a bunch of racist and sexist shit. Um, but everyone, I get their critique. They're like, wait, why is this correspondent telling this politician, hey, we miss you, especially the vice president? Like, why isn't he shouting out a question? Because I'm not CNN. And if CNN wants an answer to their questions, they know not to fucking shout it out. How do we get answers to our questions? We treat politicians like people. And politicians are not people. They are different creatures. And I say I know how to deal with asshole politicians from dealing with asshole musicians back when I covered music and entertainment. And so it's just literally treat them like people. And that means see what makes them tick. One thing I always do is when lawmakers are about to go away for a week, or say they're about to go away for the month of August, they give themselves these long vacations. I'll always say, like, hey, have a good time in sunny Florida, and then when they get back, hey, how was Florida? Because any connection, I just want to be as connected to their district and their people as possible. Because then they start to see you as like, oh, someone who knows what I'm going through. They know what my community's thinking. And honestly, the power with Askapol, even though, yeah, we have tons of, and we love you, all these followers from across the globe. Um, when we get, and we have a ton here in the States, but like when a Kentucky resident gives me a question for Mitch McConnell, Mitch McConnell, I've been the correspondent for Kentucky Public Radio. So that man has a good little hatred in me for me pushing him on the Bluegrass Army Depot. And he was gonna like lying in one of his reelection bids, saying like, look at all of this, like millions of dollars I got to clean up these old mustard gas munitions from like World War II or whatever. But like you needed billions and you're like a top appropriator. Like, bro, you could have this done if you wanted, but you just got enough in there to like win this next election.
People, yeah.
Yeah. And so when you see through them and these politicians at the local level, like it hurts. But then when you bring that question from their constituents, even if it's like a rabid liberal or whatever, um, McConnell, he's not gonna like just dismiss you because you're a Democrat in his state. Like shit, he still needs to eat dinner at Churchill Downs and in Lexington and stuff, Louisville. And so there's just a certain power that I get that I don't have as a correspondent, because I'm a fucking jackass. Nice jackass. I say I'm from the Midwest. So I say I'm like Midwestern nice, but then I got that Chicago streak in me. So you better watch out. And politicians know that because usually in like my overall theory or whatever on being a political correspondent is that our job is to get politicians to fuck up and tell us what they're actually thinking. Because remember, I'm also a political comms professor. So I've trained a lot of their press secretaries. Johns Hopkins, we're having an alumni day on the Hill this Wednesday where I'm giving my history of the media lecture. But so what I do, I invited Mitch McConnell's press secretary because he's alumni from our school, you know? And so I've trained a Trump press secretary, was a reference for her because when they go through my courses, I'm like, they become like my kids. And so, like, first thing I do first day of class is I slam the door shut and I say, I don't give a fuck about your politics. They stay out there. We're here to talk history. And like my overall motto is make politics boring again. Like politics is supposed to be people. But right now it's just politicians making bank off selling you all this bag of goods that most people now see through. And yeah, the political class, which to me increasingly includes the upper echelons of the media, like anchors and stuff like that, like they're these little fiefdoms, just like a congressional office is its own little fiefdom within a bigger system. And like just hearing how much we as reporters just like parrot the government's lines, whether it's war on drugs or whether it's like, oh, hey, new UAP report from Arrow. Look, they say there's no ET shit and they say they know all this. Wait. But what about the couple of hundred things flying over that they don't know? Like, we don't care about all the shit that you know. Like, that's by definition no longer a UFO fucking P.
Well, so it's interesting you say that because I was listening to an audiobook, Edward Bernays' Propaganda, like came full circle with me again, and I think that is the beauty.
I've now written down two book titles from you. Actually, I'm doing a study on propaganda right now. Well, I was until Ask a Poll.
Well, I hope it picks back up because I feel like it's something that I feel like more people are waking up to it though, and it's the point you just made. Like these talking heads from the news, right? It's like the news is dictated down to what's worthy of covering and how is it covered, whereas like you're able to insulate yourself from the questions everybody else is asking and be more in tune with the pulse of what people want to actually know, not something news that or topics that are dictated from the top down kind of.
Yeah. And actually the funniest thing with Ask a Poll is like so many people in our community are so well read. There's experts and like we have, people in the intel community, we have congressional staffers, politicians follow us. And so like we've got some very well read folks in there, and sometimes they'll send me these questions, and I have to remind them, like, hey, gotta remember, you're talking to preschoolers. Like a lot of this Congress, like they're just like getting their training wheels on, or no, they don't even have training wheels yet. You know, they're just learning how to draw a bike. Uh, and so that's where, and we've been seeing this play out, especially with the dynamics between the Senate and the House, where like the House, where the Congressional UAP caucus has like had all these doors kind of like shut, or doors more so like opened up a crack, and they're like, hey, we can see stuff going on in there. And they're like, yeah, but that's all you can see. And they're like, no, 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 we see movement in there now. Like you opened it up a crack. And they're like, no, 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 it's nothing to see here. Carry on. And so that's where, like you were saying earlier, with the relative youth of these newer members who mostly make up the UAP caucus, um, they don't have the seniority that the senators do. And so the senators at the table on this issue, for the most part, are those on the intelligence. Or, no, they're on the intelligence committee, because I interviewed all 100 senators last year about UAPs, about Grush's claims. Because Grush's second claim is that, hey, the executive branch is hiding these special access programs from you, Congress. And me as a congressional junkie, I'm like, ding, 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 like your oath to the Constitution means you stand up, even if them or if the presidents of your party, you stand up to them, and uh, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's been intriguing watching, because I'm so curious what senators have learned in their intel briefings, whether like they've been given the Kool-Aid in those briefings, like, hey, this is now you know, and so you can't say anything. But whatever has happened, it's not working in the intelligence community and the intelligence committee, at least in the Senate sides, like the way they want it to go. Because so after Grush testified, members of the UAP caucus demanded a skiff briefing to follow up on like half of what Grush said. He was like, yeah, I can't talk about this publicly. I can answer your questions in a skiff, in a classified setting. Well, so they have the first skiff briefing that they like, for months they wrangled over it, and they finally get the briefing, and everyone leaves. And I think there's only like 6 or 8, maybe 10 folks in there, but like not that many, 8 to 10. And they all came out just like in unison, just frustrated and being like, these people don't take us seriously. They're like, they should have known we were going to ask these. So, like, for them to not have an answer to like this basic question means like they're not taking us seriously. So, like, they banded together, demanded a second skip briefing. Well, that happened right at the start of the new year, I believe January. And there were 16 members there, according to Tim Burchett. Well, so instead of like the secret, the old school way of doing it, just like, oh, it'll pass over, it kind of blew up, and there was more of a demand. And someone like, AOC was in that one, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but then also Ro Khanna, fairly moderate, forward-thinking California progressive. There's nothing moderate about him, but he's forward-thinking, whatever that. But then you also had like a Nancy Mace, a moderate Republican. And so that's where whatever they're trying to do. Oh, and then remember, after the Grush hearing, Congressman Jamie Raskin, the top Democrat on the House Oversight Committee, who also led one of Trump's impeachments, and was on that J6 committee, Jamie Raskin, he's at the table on this. And he left the Grush hearing like, yeah, we need a classified briefing. I've got tons of questions after this. And he's like, Grush was credible, etc. And so that's where there's still some voices out there trying to like be dismissive of the issue, be dismissive of the community, etc. No, 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 no. Like, this is like,
You see it losing steam.
the issue on the hill.
It seemed like after the second skiff that there was a renewed sense of vigor. It validated a lot of what Brush said, but it's gone quiet, generally speaking. I mean, I know that you're still nipping at the heels of people, but it does seem like there's this lull. Like there was talk of Grush doing an op-ed, and then you broke news that he might be potentially joining as a congressional aide. But I haven't seen the huge war cries from the UAP caucus since that skiff.
But here, everyone has to remember this, and like, I get it. Well, no, I get both. I get how people in all these communities, whether it's, cannabis, like, oh, they're going to deschedule. What the fuck does that matter if your brother's in jail? You know? And so UAPs, it's like, well, if someone had an interaction with them or blah, blah, blah. So, like, yeah, it matters. But, like, this is Congress we're dealing with. And so I always remind people, like, the Democratic Party really cared about universal health care. They cared about it for 100 years, more than 100 years. They campaigned on it. And then after about 100 years, they fell just short of it. So it took them 100 years to kind of fail at what they set out to do. That is politics. Like it takes a long time to maybe even not accomplish something. But we've actually seen a lot of movement in this space. What's happening now is, well, it's March 15th today. Next week, I think on the 22nd, the government might shut down. There was a federal government shutdown looming last week, which
Right.
they got out of it just in the nick of time, Batman. But then because they like separated the government funding stuff, there's now a second one, and that might be triggered next week. So like, even though Congress got back, and like this Congress is still kind of reeling from the historical ousting of the speaker. Like I tell everyone, I gave up on predictions after Trump won the GOP primary in 2016. I come from a family of Republicans and conservatives, and I'm like, well, my grandpa's spinning in his grave. But you, with this, we just have this like new order here in Washington, but you also have, oh, so yeah, with the historical ousting, like they didn't just shut Congress down. And what? Probably covered three, maybe five government shutdowns. Like I spent lots of Christmases alone at the Capitol being like, fuck these lawmakers, government shut down and they're not even here. I'm here alone. Grumble, grumble. That's when you bring good scotch with you to the Capitol. Put it next to my bottle of moonshine, which came in handy on January 6th.
I bet.
But so with that, you had this historical, like they shut down Congress. And like there was 1 week where Congress was shut down for those 3 weeks after McCarthy was ousted, where the Senate just like took off for a week because they were like, yeah, we have a government funding deadline looming. But who do we talk to about it? And Schumer's like, hey, everyone go campaign, raise more money. Um, he's a lazy SOB, only cares about reelection. And so that's where this whole Congress has been starts and stops. And like we've seen Speaker Johnson fumble with his training wheels. He's brought so many bills to the floor that then failed. Um, that you kind of have like that really sucks a lot of the air out of the Republican Party. And so when you have their speaker, and so if you're looking at someone like Tim Burchett, Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna, Ogles, like, and Burleson, Laslo Burleson. No, I guess he's Freedom Caucus. Like all those folks, they tend to be the more far right, and it's actually interesting. Gates isn't officially a part of the UAP caucus, but I think 3 or 4 of the UAP members were part of the 8 that ousted McCarthy. And so, like on paper, that can like work against the cause because that there's old school Republicans like McCarthy who are looking for revenge any spot they can get on the historic ousting of McCarthy. But so you've had all of these, like this Congress just hasn't found its mojo. And I think at this point, I'm starting to feel like that is this Congress's mojo. Like It's
Right.
just dysfunctional. It's got like shirt on backwards, like two pairs of pants on, one facing one direction. Like this just ain't a Congress you want your kids to see.
Yeah, it seems like it's only going to be more and more dysfunctional with like what's going on with in Gaza right now, and with the presidential election coming up. Like, there's just a lot of like really hot button issues that will, certainly prevent things from going forward. Right? There's just too many people are being pulled too many different directions to really focus in on something.
And that's where like this is where I'm always devil's advocate. Just 'cause I do try to see the world from so many different perspectives.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm like, God, I lost my train of thought. I should sleep more. Read this. Wait, what were we on? Because it was a good
I
thought.
was just kind of go, continuing the thread that you said about how like this Congress's MO is fumbling around, right? Not getting stuff done because they're young, they're disjointed.
That's it. So yeah, that can become an excuse and like a crutch that lawmakers use. But like that's kind of the beauty of ask a poll because sometimes it's been not frustrating for me, but just like if I'm sitting there covering this, like, and this is where us as reporters need to like check ourselves because like State of the Union night, boom, I'm trapped in there. So all I see is this like limited world. And it's just what I'm allowed to see. And so that's where I always try to afterwards read other folks' stories, read what reporters were reporting on the other side of the Capitol. Um, just because we are such subjective creatures and just limited by our own sight, sound, and all that. And so, yeah, lawmakers have a little bit of a point when they're like, well, hey, there's this big thing going on. But I'm like, no, we all have to remind ourselves that, for one, we got new technology these days. Like, y'all should be able to walk, chew gum, and run a robot at the same time, or five robots. And so that's where lawmakers can use it as an excuse, but the beauty of ask a poll is like whether it's raining, whether it's snowing, whether the Capitol's on fire, metaphorically or literally, it seems. There's always going to be UAP questions coming in on my phone, and so with some lawmakers, especially in the Senate, I'll get some annoyance from lawmakers. They'll be like, "Oh, you're asking me about this," and you'll hear it in our last exclusive with Intel chair Mark Warner in the Senate, and he is like, "Oh," and he kind of makes a joke, and I've known him for years. I've been a correspondent for Virginia Public Radio and DC's NPR station, WAMU, and so like Warner knows me, and so we're always joking with each other. But like this one, you'll hear it. He kind of sets me off, and I don't show my Chicago with the fury I did back in the day on the streets. Now I just like use what I've read and shit. And so with Warner, you see it, I kind of get in his face, and I'm like, we've got objects. Like Senator Gillibrand just got back from her tour of Nevada with Air Force, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman. And she said her takeaway from that is she's like terrified that there's this persistent problem of objects that are unidentified. So that's UAPs, guys, but hovering over sensitive military sites. And so one thing Gillibrand, even though talks on the Schumer UAP amendment from the NDAA last year, which Gillibrand was a part of, even though those talks haven't rekindled yet, she still knows in this year's NDAA she wants more sensors to track what's over these sensitive military sites. And so I bring that up to Warner. I'm like, hey, one of your Senate Intel members said this. And so like I know you want to laugh off ET and extraterrestrial stuff. Because honestly, even if he knew, like he's getting paid. So if he knew,
Yeah.
that's where with him, I have to change my strategy. I'm not going to go at it from the UAP thing. And I know this is going to anger some folks in the community, but I'm just going to ask them about the Chinese spy balloon because
Yeah.
that's what they say. whatever those objects were, they all admit that first one, Chinese spy balloon, that like we drop about $1 trillion of our taxpayer dollars annually on the biggest military, best military in the world. They got all the toys they need, and they let a motherfucking balloon invade US airspace. I do not want a day to go by that those senators don't look at me and feel bad for not doing their constitutional duty, that they let us on their watch get invaded by a fucking balloon.
It's an absolute shame. I'm glad you're doing that. Yeah, keep rubbing that in their face, because that is the joke. What, we spend more on the military than the next several countries combined, but we can't somehow prevent a balloon, a spy balloon, from entering aerospace.
Yeah, let alone other stuff that moves really fast.
Yeah.
As Senator Kane, when he was governor of Virginia, we have our exclusive with him up on the site. He said something like, "Yeah, all I know is they were fast movers." Like, and he's basically saying they're not balloons. Like some of them, like some might be balloons or whatever. But he's like, no, some of what they see off our coast are fast freaking movers, and that's what I'm still also feeling out with Senate Intel. It does kind of feel like, oh yeah, because Gillibrand's out there in Nevada. She doesn't just meet with the Air Force for the classified portion of her trip. She also meets with Lockheed and Northrop Grumman. And it's like, wait, I've read a biography on every US president, and I kind of remember that one guy, Eisenhower, talking about the military industrial complex. And so with this, it's fascinating to me that in the House, especially after that second skip briefing, those members, and like, this is why AOC's at the table, because she was investigating military industrial complex in its contemporary form, which is the defense contracting industrial complex. And so I'm really curious about that, because it's interesting as the House members investigate that more. You have senators who, when they go on classified briefings out west, they need to stop at Lockheed and Northrop Grumman. I'm like, interesting. And I was flown out. Playboy flew me out in the 2016 election to Denver to profile former Senator Cory Gardner, and the whole profile became about him running away from me and his staff, like blocking him. Well, one of the things his staff did to block me was they kept having all these really important meetings, with State Department officials who like were in charge of the passport stuff or whatever. Well, it was closed press, so I could sit in there, but no recording. I'm like, what the fuck? Like, and then they brought me to, I need to look back up what facility it was, but they were literally shooting a rocket into space that day. And I'll never forget it. Senator James Inhofe, who was then chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, he was out there, and it was literally just a shakedown for campaign dollars from the chair. So this last Playboy print edition ever, I got my Gardner profile up in there. Before that, I got this. Jim Inhofe. Oh, I stole the fuck out of this. Team ICBM? Oh yeah. Like, I won't take anything for free from lawmakers, but I'll steal their stuff when they're not looking. But so Inhofe is handing out these like purely political, and like in the room is just all these senior DPs of industry, so Lockheed, Northrop, everyone. So you have all those folks in there, and because Gardner couldn't do it himself, Inhofe leaned out, and again, this was closed door. So he leaned down and said, "Hey, we need people like Cory Gardner in there, saying donate to his campaign, et cetera, et cetera." And so that's where I'm so curious about that other world where it's Team ICBM. Yeah, tell me more about Team ICBM. And so it is fascinating to me, because especially like in states like Connecticut, where you have these progressive anti-war Democrats, they love the military industrial complex. Like, they are going to war fighting for the guy Joe Courtney, who we got up on our site askapol.com right now is the third most senior Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, or HASC. Well, he's going to war for an extra submarine, I guess. I think the military is like, yeah, we don't need it, but like, 'cause they've got Sikorsky, they've got all those up in Connecticut. So like, there's a difference in their minds between home state jobs and weapons of war. And I'm like, wait, those two are the same. No, it's defense. We need a big defense. Really? Well, then get something to look at the balloons.
Yeah, how's that working out so far? But it's interesting. It does seem to be sprinkled more and more throughout a lot of states. And then you've got these senators and House reps that are rallying, like to when they're up for reelection. Like, I brought so many jobs to, like, Gene Shaheen in New Hampshire. Like, we brought a ton of jobs here. Well, yeah, you're bringing jobs that are heavily skewed towards the military industrial complex, building more weapons. And, there's always the need for more conflict to, keep selling weapons. And it's just a never ending cycle in some ways.
And to put a fine point on my rambling, one thing I've noticed that is just kind of innate in our jobs is political correspondence, but like the House and the Senate, it's like the Capitol is its own universe. It's like Washington is its own universe, or its own solar system. Then the Capitol is its own universe within that system. But then the House and the Senate, just literally, they are two different worlds. And so a lot of times, like what the NDAA, the Schumer's UAP amendment last year to the NDAA, members of the Congressional UAP caucus first learned about it from me. Well, from you all, our subscribers at Ask a Poll. So, like, literally, we're listening on one of our exclusives with him. He's like, "Oh, I gotta check that out. I've got to go talk to them and make sure to protect this." So, part of that, you saw those members getting on the NDAA and focusing on that UAP amendment very late in the process last year. But one thing I'm kind of noticing, I need next time I get Gillibrand, even when Gillibrand hasn't done her homework, that she hasn't this week. She hadn't read the Arrow report when I asked her about it yesterday, and I don't know if I'm going to publish that interview because it might make her mad, but I might publish it because it might make her mad. We'll see what kind of mood I'm in. But I'm pretty sure Gillibrand has no idea that her home state lawmaker, AOC, is this like household name and internet phenom who someone like Gillibrand needs, especially if she wants the White House in the future. AOC is investigating the UAP issue because of the defense contracting industry. Well, then New York's senator is out there having cocktails or coffees or whatever with the military industrial complex in Nevada. And it's like, maybe you two should talk. Because I'm pretty sure.
Or would they really want to talk? Would they be at odds with each other, different agendas?
Agendas maybe, but I think different information. And I think that's what I'm still sniffing around on whether, like, because part of me thinks that Senate Intel knows a lot. But like so much, because you remember right after the Grush claims dropped last late spring 2023, you had Senate Intel Vice Chair Marco Rubio come out hot and heavy on the issue, and you had Gillibrand hot, like they were going to own this scandal, they were going to get to the bottom of it, and then within like a month or two, both got really quiet, and I'm like, what briefing did you have?
Right.
Who gave it to you? What did they say? Like, did someone get your ear, or is there an explanation for a lot of this stuff? Like, a lot of these fast moving shit that we're seeing, like, is that just a new Northrop Grumman toy? So, like, Warner and Rubio are like, oh, yeah, we know about that. Over on the House side, because they don't have the clearance, they're like, what is this fast moving shit? And so that's where I don't, like, that's not confirmed. It's just this hunch that I have. And then part of me thinks even if you had members of the UAP caucus in those briefings, well, they'd be asking different questions than these
Yeah.
senators who aren't that inquisitive. And so maybe it was easy to placate these senators on intel, but I don't think their House counterparts would buy that. And so it's really fascinating watching these two, or I can't even call it two investigations anymore. It's the House investigation and the Senate, whatever they're doing.
Right. Unknown, right? No,
Well, I got to bounce in a minute. This has been fun, man. We got to do
no,
this again.
yeah, honestly, I really appreciate you jumping on and just, opening up and sharing about what you're doing. I think it's the greatest thing ever. I think it's, I hope more people catch on to it and join what I feel is kind of like a movement and part of a shift in journalism. So, thanks for
I just hope I don't fuck it up.
You're not gonna fuck it up. You're crushing it.
Knock on wood.
The only way you can fuck it up is by not continuing what you're doing.
I'm like, I fucked up royally in my life. I'm good at fucking up.
I don't think you're in any jeopardy of that. I think you're doing something great, and I think a lot of people appreciate you. So thanks for doing this, and thanks for doing what you're doing.